Welcome to the Chosen Few, where today we take you back to the early hours of May 10th, 1940. As we join No. 12 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, as the German army floods across the borders. Today we will ask you to pick a number between 1 and 12 and pop your answer in the comments below. Then we will see at the end if you were luckier than those that took part in the missions over the next few days. May 10th, 1940. RAF Omifontaine, France, Advanced Air Striking Force, 0430 hours. The end of silence. The war did not start with a bang for LAC Billy Croft. It started with a vibration. Billy, a 19-year-old rigger from Manchester, was asleep under the wing of a Fairey Battle light bomber, serial number P2204. It was strictly against regulations to sleep on the flight line, but the barracks were stuffy, and the French spring air was cool and smelled of damp grass. For 6 months during the phony war, Billy had polished this aircraft until he could see his own grime-streaked face in the aluminium. He called her the old girl. He woke up because the ground was shivering. He sat up, blinking against the dawn mist. It was a thick, grey soup that obscured the perimeter fence. The vibration grew louder, a deep, rhythmic drumming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It wasn't the erratic clatter of a farm tractor. It was the synchronized drone of engines, hundreds of them. Then, the siren cut the morning in half. The wail rose from the village of Omifontaine first, a ghostly cry, followed instantly by the harsh, metallic blare of the station klaxon. A shout came from Sergeant Major Hayes, a man whose voice could strip paint at 50 paces. He was sprinting down the flight line, still buttoning his tunic. "Get the covers off. Priming crews, move. This is it, you useless lot. Jerry is crossing the border." Billy scrambled out from under the wing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The airfield, silent moments ago, erupted into chaos. Mechanics emerged from tents. Pilots burst from the mess hall pulling flight jackets over pajamas, and fuel bozers roared to life. "Billy, get the chocks." Sergeant Maclean came running toward the old girl. Mac was the pilot, a calm, pipe-smoking Scotsman who usually treated the war like a mild inconvenience. Today, his eyes were wide, the pupils dilated. "What's happening, Sarge?" Billy shouted, yanking the heavy wooden chocks away from the wheels. "They're invading, lad," Mac said, swinging himself up onto the wing root. "Holland, Belgium, the whole bloody lot. Gliders taking forts, paratroopers dropping on airfields. We're going up soon, is she ready?" Billy scrambled up the wing to help Mac strap in. As he replied, "As ready as she will ever be." He looked into the cockpit. It smelled of leather, sweat, and high-octane fuel. Flight Sergeant Artie Price, the observer, was already in the middle seat, frantically organizing maps. "Luxembourg," Artie muttered, tapping a chart. "They're pouring through Luxembourg. That's Panzer country." "We'll stop 'em, won't we?" Billy asked, as he was fastening Mac's harness. He wanted reassurance. He wanted Mac to make a joke about German sausages. Mac looked at Billy. The pilot's face was grim. "We're going to try, Billy. Just make sure that engine doesn't quit on me." 12-15 hours. The briefing had been short. The target was a German armored column advancing through the Ardennes, near the Luxembourg border. As the formation of Fairey Battles roared over the French countryside, Artie Price lay prone in the bottom of the fuselage, peering through the bomb-aiming window. The world rushed by in a blur of green and brown. They were flying so low, they had to pull up to clear church steeples. Crossing the border now, Mac's voice crackled over the intercom. It sounded tinny distant. "Keep your eyes peeled for fighters." Clear in the back came the voice of Corporal Sparky Jones, the wireless operator. Sparky was manning the single 303 machine gun in the rear. He sounded terrified. Artie watched the ground. The roads below were clogged with refugees. Carts, cars, people walking west. But as they crossed into Luxembourg, the roads emptied. Then he saw them. "Target ahead," Artie shouted. 12 o'clock. It's the whole bloody Wehrmacht. Stretched out along the road was a grey snake of vehicles. Trucks, half-tracks, and the angular, terrifying shapes of tanks. "Bomb doors open," Mac said. The aircraft shuddered as the hydraulics whined. And then, the world exploded, the floor right next to Artie's head. Splinters of wood and metal sprayed his face. "They've got our range," Artie screamed. "Mac, jink left." "I can't." Mac grunted, wrestling the stick. "We have to hold steady for the drop." To their right, another Fairey Battle from the squadron, L4949, was taking a beating. Artie watched in horror as a line of tracer fire walked along its fuselage. The engine cowl of L4949 erupted in flames. "Simpson's hit," Sparky yelled from the back. "Focus," Mac roared. "Bombs away." The aircraft lurched upward, relieved of the weight. "Brake right. Go, go," Artie yelled. Mac hauled the heavy bomber into a steep bank. The G-force pressed Artie into the floor. Through the side window, he saw their bombs exploding in the woods next to the road. A puff of smoke that looked pathetic compared to the inferno coming up at them. He looked back. L4949 was going down. It wasn't a glide, it was a fall. The burning plane smashed into a field near a line of trees. It bounced once, slewing sideways, tearing its wings off, and came to a halt as a burning wreck. Did they get out? Artie wondered to himself. "Bandits!" Sparky screamed. "Messerschmitts. 6 o'clock high. They're diving." The Fairey Battle was a slow, lumbering beast. Against a Messerschmitt Bf 109, it was prey. "Get down, Artie!" Mac shouted. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. Bullets ripped through the tail. The sound was deafening, like a jackhammer on a tin roof. Sparky was firing back, his single gun popping defiantly, but it was hopeless. Mac threw the battle into a dive, heading for the tree line. Hanging on, they skimmed the treetops, leaves actually brushing the undercarriage. The German fighter, unable to follow the clumsy bomber into the weeds without crashing, pulled up, its engine screaming. "Engine temp is climbing," Mac said, his voice trembling for the first time. "We're leaking coolant. We're limping home, boys." 2,100 hours. Night fell over Omifontaine, but nobody slept. The darkness was illuminated by distant flashes on the horizon and the glow of cigarettes on the flight line. Billy Croft stood by the old girl. She was a mess. There were holes in the fuselage you could put a fist through. The hydraulic lines were severed, and the cockpit was awash with fluid. But she was back. Other spaces on the grass were empty. Billy walked into the NCO mess hall. It was usually a noisy place, full of banter and cards. Tonight, it was silent. He saw Artie Price sitting in the corner, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Artie's face was grey, still smeared with oil and cordite. Billy sat down opposite him. "Is she bad, Artie?" Artie looked up, his eyes hollow. "We saw Simpson go in. Just a ball of fire, Billy. We didn't do a thing. We dropped our bombs, and they just kept coming. It was like throwing pebbles at a fortress." "Did anyone see parachutes?" Artie shook his head. "Too low. No time." The door opened, and Sergeant Major Hayes walked in. He looked older than he had that morning. "Right," Hayes said, his voice lacking its usual boom. "Listen in. Intelligence says the Germans have taken the bridges in Holland. They are advancing fast. Tomorrow we go back up." A murmur of disbelief went through the room. "Back up," someone shouted. "In what? We lost half the squadron today." "We go back up," Hayes repeated, staring them down. "Because if we don't stop them at the river, there's nothing stopping them until Paris." Hayes looked at Artie. "Price, Maclean, your kite is being patched up. You're on the roster for 8 o'clock. Artie nodded slowly. He looked at Billy. "Get her ready, Billy," Artie said softly. "Patch the holes with fabric and dope. Just make it look like a plane, yeah?" Billy nodded, feeling a lump in his throat the size of a fist. "I'll have her ready, Artie. I promise." As Billy walked back out into the cool night air to work on the battered machine, he looked east. The flashing on the horizon was brighter now. The war was 1 day old, and they were already losing. Billy was working on the old girl's fuselage when the phone rang in the NCO shack. Sergeant Major Hayes answered, his face draining of color. "Berrio back? Christ, really? What's the damage?" He slammed the phone down. "That was HQ. Berrio back just got walloped by Heinkels. They even bombed and strafed the ground crews. The war isn't just up high, lads. We will have to be on our toes from now on." May 11th, 1940 RAF Omifontaine and the Ardennes. 0800 hours. The air at Omifontaine was cold, thick with the smell of wet earth and fresh dope. LAC Billy Croft worked with desperate speed. The old girl's fuselage, where enemy fire had punched holes the size of teacups, was now patched with canvas fabric, treated with cellulose nitrate dope, and painted hastily. The patches felt like thick, brittle skin, a thin lie against the brute reality of German flak. "It'll hold the air," Sergeant Major Hayes grunted, wiping a smear of oil from his cheek. "That's all we can ask for." The flight line was a ghost of its former self. Of the 12 Fairey Battles the squadron had at dawn yesterday, only 7 remained flyable. 2 were beyond repair, stripped for parts. 3 were simply gone, along with their 9 crewmen. Flight Sergeant Artie Price walked up to the aircraft, his uniform freshly pressed, but his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Nice job, Billy. Looks like an angry patchwork quilt." "She's sound, Artie," Billy mumbled, checking the propeller hub one last time. He wanted to tell Artie not to go. He wanted to confess he'd found a splintered piece of shrapnel embedded in the tail wheel well, and had almost left his own finger on it. But he only nodded. Artie climbed into the middle seat. Sergeant Maclean started the engines. The roar of the Merlin drowned out the silence that had gripped the squadron since the first mission. This mission was a repeat of yesterday: attack the advancing columns. But today, the targets were closer, and the ground defenses were better organized. 11:30 hours. Artie's face was pressed against the glass. He felt like a beetle scuttling across a sheet of sandpaper. They were so low the individual branches of trees were visible. "Artie," Mac's voice came through the headphones. "I'm getting reports. We're going into the thick of it. The guys ahead of us, they're calling this a slaughterhouse." The flak started instantly. Not the sporadic burst of yesterday, but a curtain of fire that seemed designed to shred the air itself. Artie saw it before Mac did. Tracer, a dense swarm of glowing dots that converged on a single point. "Corporal Sparky," Jones started screaming from the back. "Bandit, 5 o'clock, high and diving. They look like 109s. Mac threw the control column forward, diving the heavy bomber toward the ground, making the pursuit harder. Artie looked up, spotting the BF 109, a sleek, lethal arrow compared to their lumbering bus. The Messerschmitt was fast, a silvery streak that materialized out of the sun. It fired a short burst. You heard the thud of the impacts as they hit the fuselage. "Sparky, you hit?" Mac shouted. "No, sir. Just the radio box," Sparky replied, his voice high-pitched but steadying. "He's gone high." They flew on, the mission becoming a grim exercise in survival. They spotted the enemy columns. Massive, flowing rivers of grey steel, winding through the valleys of the Ardennes. Mac flew straight into the thickest concentration of fire, held the battle steady as a rock, and released the bombs. Artie didn't wait to see the impact. They turned tail and ran. 3 Fairey Battles had taken off with them. As Mac banked hard, Artie scanned the sky. One was gone. The silence where its radio signal should have been was confirmation enough. 1,700 hours. Billy was cleaning the flare pistol when Sergeant Major Hayes called an impromptu muster. The atmosphere was tense. "Listen up," Hayes shouted. "That was HQ. They report massive damage to the ASF airfields. Berrio back got hit hard yesterday evening by Heinkels. They've hit us on the ground and in the air." Billy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The fear wasn't about missing targets, it was about the air itself closing in on them. Hayes pointed to a patch of grass near the hangar. "We will be digging slit trenches tonight. Deep ones. I want every man on the perimeter looking up." A distant rumble started, not of planes, but of artillery. It was too far to be French. "That," Hayes said, pointing east, "is why you will work faster. And that, lads, is why the old girl has to fly again tomorrow." 2,200 hours. Artie and Mac made it back, their aircraft now almost unrecognizable under a fresh layer of bullet holes. They were one of the lucky few. Of the 8 Fairey Battles launched that day across the squadron, 7 were destroyed or abandoned. The squadron was functionally shattered. The aircrew gathered in the mess hall. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of boots scraping on the stone floor. The officers looked like ghosts. The commanding officer, CO, stood at the head of the table. His face was a mask of sorrow and determination. "Gentlemen," the CO began, his voice barely a whisper, "the Germans have crossed the Meuse River. The front line is collapsing faster than anyone predicted. If they consolidate their position, the battle for France, and perhaps the war, is over." He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. There are key bridges they must use. Veldwezelt and Vrouwenhoven over the Albert Canal. They are heavily defended. We know they are defended. We are the only unit close enough that can reach them before dawn. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on them. This is not a mission. It is a sacrifice. I need crews that understand they may not return. I need volunteers. Artie looked across the table at Mac. Mac's gaze was already fixed on the CO. Before the CO could finish, Mac stood up, ramrod straight. Artie, feeling the cold, sickening dread of certainty, stood beside him. Then, every man in the room, from the most terrified junior pilot to the oldest observer, rose to his feet. The CO nodded slowly, his eyes brimming. "Thank you, gentlemen. The pilots selected will be briefed at 030 hours. May God be with you all." As they dispersed, Artie felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mac. "Well, Artie," Mac said, forcing a crooked smile. "Looks like we fly tomorrow. I hope they don't pick the old girl. Billy would cry." Artie looked down at his trembling hands. He was ready to face flak, but he was not ready to face the selection process. May 12th, 1940 RAF Omifontaine and the Albert Canal, Belgium 0300 hours. The briefing room was quiet enough to hear the scratching of a pencil. It was standing room only, crowded with men whose eyes held the exhaustion of 2 days of near-constant loss. The commanding officer stood before a large, hastily drawn map. The 2 target points, Vrouwenhoven and Veldwezelt, were marked in blood-red grease pencil where the German spearheads were crossing the Albert Canal. "Gentlemen, as you know, every man volunteered," the CO said, his voice husky. "We cannot send every serviceable aircraft, or the squadron ceases to exist. We have enough fit aircraft for 5 crews." He held up a small, worn leather helmet. Inside it were slips of paper. "I have placed the names of all aircrew into this helmet. We will draw the 5 names who will lead this charge." Flight Sergeant Artie Price felt a cold sweat break out on his temples. Beside him, Sergeant Maclean stood motionless, his shoulders squared. The CO called the first name, Flying Officer Garland, pilot. A cheerless wave of recognition went through the room. Garland, a popular and steady pilot, stood up, receiving handshakes that felt more like final farewells. The names followed in grim succession: 2 more pilots, 2 observers, 2 gunners. Mac's name hadn't been called. The room thinned out. The lucky, or perhaps the unlucky, unpicked pilots stumbled out to catch another hour of sleep they likely wouldn't use. The helmet came around again for the final pilots and crews. Artie squeezed his eyes shut as the CO's hand reached in. Pilot Officer Davy, pilot. Davy, pale but resolute, stepped forward. The helmet came to rest on the table. Only 2 slips remained. One for the final pilot, one for the final observer. The CO drew 1 slip. "Pilot, Maclean." Mac met Artie's eyes. It was a moment of absolute, devastating clarity. They were going. Artie didn't wait for the final draw. "Observer, Price, sir. We fly together." The CO nodded once. "Then get to your aircraft, Price." 0530 hours. LAC Billy Croft couldn't look Artie in the eye. He stood on the damp grass beside the old girl, now designated P-2204, to be Garland's wingman, his hands tightening the oil filler cap. "Promise me you'll bring her back, Artie," Billy mumbled. Artie smiled, the tired lines around his eyes deepening. "If she's airborne, we'll aim her for Omifontaine, Billy. You just keep the coffee warm." Mac was already in the cockpit. Artie strapped himself into the observer's position. He looked out and saw Flying Officer Garland in the lead aircraft, his observer Sergeant Grey, giving a thumbs up. 5 Fairey Battles, the total effective fighting strength of the squadron, lined up on the grass strip. Engines running, Mac called. The 5 Merlin engines roared to life, shaking the very ground beneath Billy's feet. As the first light of dawn broke, the 5 battles taxied out. Billy watched them. He didn't wave. He simply stood at attention, watching the 5 aircraft accelerate down the grass. They lifted heavily into the air, turning east, toward the rising sun and the bridges. 0700 hours. The flight was silent until they reached the Dutch border. The sky was clear, the perfect canvas for a massacre. "We have our escort," Mac announced. 2 Hurricanes from an intercepting squadron appeared briefly overhead, small and fast. "Don't count on them staying, lads." Artie lay prone in the nose, peering through the bombsight. Below, the Albert Canal was a silver ribbon cutting through the green fields. And there were the bridges too intact, horrifyingly busy stretches of steel, teeming with German trucks. "Flak up ahead," Sparky warned from the rear. "It's thick, Mac." It was worse than any description. The air above the bridges was a churning cloud of exploding shells and crisscrossing tracer fire. It was a solid, impenetrable ceiling. "They're waiting for us," Mac said, his voice flat. "Garland is going straight in. We follow, Artie. When he drops, you drop." The lead battle, Garland's machine, dipped its nose, committing to the run. It dove low over the canal. Mac followed, fighting the turbulence caused by the exploding flak. "Steady," Artie screamed, fighting to keep the sight centered on the steel supports. "Flak hitting us. Mac, we're taking fire." The Fairey Battle felt like a drum being beaten by a dozen hammers. The cockpit filled with the stench of burning metal and ozone. Artie glanced up, searching for Garland. The lead plane was a second from the drop point when it staggered. A shell, a big one, tore through its port wing. The battle didn't explode. It simply buckled, lost all control, and plunged, tail first, into the water of the canal. "Garland's down," Sparky shouted. "Hold fast," Mac roared, tears streaming down his face from the wind and the strain. "Hold it, Artie." Artie, blinded by the terrifying reality, fought to find the aiming point. He saw another battle veer off wildly as its pilot lost control. "Dropping," Artie shouted, hitting the release. The bombs dropped, and Mac pulled the stick back with every ounce of strength he had, throwing P-2204 into a climbing turn. The Messerschmitts were on them instantly. 2 Bf-109s tore past, their cannons flashing. Sparky screamed, his .303 chattering a desperate challenge. Crack! The engine stuttered. A chunk of metal the size of Artie's fist tore out of the right wing. "Mac, we're hit bad. Can you fly?" Mac didn't answer. He was grunting, wrestling the stick to keep the nose level. "Heading west, Artie. I'm going to put her on the ground." Of the 5 planes that went in, only one was still flying, Mac and Artie's battered machine. 0830 hours. Billy Croft was sitting on the grass, numbly watching the empty eastern sky when he heard it. A sputtering, ragged noise that sounded less like an aircraft and more like a car backfiring. He leapt up. A single Fairey Battle, trailing a thick plume of black smoke, was limping toward the airfield. It wobbled badly, its undercarriage hanging low, its camouflage unrecognizable under dust and oil. "It's Mac! It's the old girl!" Billy screamed, running toward the runway. Mac brought the plane down hard, bouncing once, then screeching as the remaining tire burst. It slewed sideways and ground to a halt 50 yards from the hangar. Billy sprinted to the wreck. Mac cut the engine, the silence that followed more jarring than the noise. Artie and Mac climbed out, covered in hydraulic fluid, oil and sweat. Their faces were black. Artie's flight suit was shredded across his left shoulder. Mac pulled off his helmet. "Forgone, Billy. Forgone," he whispered. Billy helped them stagger toward the barracks. Sergeant Major Hayes met them at the entrance. He looked at the wreckage, then at the 2 surviving men. "Get them medical attention. Debriefing in 1 hour." He looked at Mac, his eyes red-rimmed. "Garland and Grey, they didn't make it, did they?" Mac shook his head, unable to speak. Hayes swallowed hard, staring at the 5 empty chairs in the mess hall. They had bought the British Expeditionary Force perhaps a few hours, paid for with the lives of 12 men. "They did their duty, lads," Hayes muttered, looking at the distant, silent horizon. Now get some sleep. We have to make sure the war doesn't take the rest of us. The story of the Fairey Battle crews and the ground staff of No.12 Squadron during those 72 hours, from May 10th to May 12th, 1940, is not one of victory, but of profound sacrifice and unflinching duty. It is the story of the British Expeditionary Force's Forgotten Air Wing, decimated not by cowardice, but by obsolescence and impossible orders. For Billy Croft, the rigger, the war arrived not with a declaration, but with the sound of incoming German engines and the visceral horror of having to patch bullet holes in the fuselages of his friends' planes, knowing the silken dope repairs wouldn't stop the steel coming back the next day. He witnessed the swift, brutal end of the phony war and the chilling reality that the Luftwaffe was not a distant threat, but a storm overhead. For Artie Price and Maclean, the aircrew, the experience was a descent into a specific, concentrated hell. They navigated the sheer terror of flying the slow, underdefended Fairey Battle through a wall of lead, watching their comrades, their squadron family, vanish in balls of fire over the fields of Luxembourg. They survived day 1, endured day 2, and by day 3, they understood the grim equation: every flight was a gamble where the house held all the cards. Their ultimate sacrifice, the volunteering for the Maastricht Bridges raid, was not an act of blind heroism, but a calm, professional decision made in the face of inevitable collapse. They knew the bridges had to fall, even if their planes fell with them. The single, smoke-trailing Fairey Battle that limped back to Omi-Fontaine on May 12th was the physical embodiment of the cost. It carried 2 survivors, but it left behind the legacy of the fallen, including Garland and Gray, whose extreme courage that day earned the war's first Air Victoria Crosses. By the time the squadron was eventually forced to retreat, they had lost most of their aircraft and men. But they achieved their final objective. They bought precious time. Time for the ground forces to regroup, time for the rest of the RAF to ready itself for the coming battle over Britain, and time for the world to witness the extraordinary, immediate courage of the ASF. Men who faced their fate with a salute and a roaring Merlin engine. Their endurance in those 72 hours was the foundation upon which the rest of the war would be fought. Out of the 12 aircraft that started the war, the only survivor was aircraft number 3 and her crew. We do not know the names of all of the fallen from the squadron. We do, however, know the names of the crews that took part in the fatal last mission. So I now ask you in joining me for a moment to remember the few. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.